What is going on, YouTube people? New Cards and Comics here. Today, we're going to dive back into the PSA centering topic. I have reached out to our old friend Gemrate and said, "Hey, kind of data? What does the Gemrate percentages look like over time for PSA across varying eras? Do you have that?" And he says, "Of course I do." He says, "Give me a little bit." So shout out to Gemrate with a major assist on this video. We'll dive into that in a minute. Let's review really quickly. This popped up late last week when the internet discovered that PSA on the down low, behind the scenes, updated their grading standards on their website. Currently, it reads, "The image must be centered on the card within a tolerance not to exceed approximately 55-45 on the front, 75-25 on the back for a PSA 10. Earlier in January, this is what it read. "The image must be centered on the card within a tolerance not to exceed approximately 55-45 to 60-40 on the front and 75-25 on the back." The 60-40 was removed. When questioned on this, PSA put out this statement. We'll give you guys a little zoom here. "We did recently update the language around our grading standards on our website to specify that the targeted threshold for centering for a card to qualify for a PSA 10 grade is 55-45. This has long been the ideal centering threshold to achieve a PSA 10 grade, though 60-40 was denoted to factor in that, at the grader's sole discretion, a small variance may be permitted on occasion based on the card's overall eye appeal. To clarify, this variance from 55-45 for a PSA 10 grade can still happen today, again, at the individual grader's discretion, and this centering note is also denoted on our grading standards page." This has set the internet ablaze. Hour-long live streams this is being discussed on. Many videos this is being discussed on. Who knew what, when, where, why, who said what in DMs, and all sorts of other nonsense. I am frankly a little bit of two minds here. I think this is one of those, situations where there are two sides to this. I agree that PSA should have handled this much better. They should not have tried to stealthy change this thing and not let anyone know what is going on publicly and just update the websites behind the scenes and kind of hope nobody would notice. And shocking, the internet figured it out and it blew up into this big old thing. So I do not agree with the way that PSA has kind of handled this whole situation. That being said, I generally think, like, I kind of buy what they are saying in regards to the 60-40, 55-45. If you were submitting a card that was 60-40, that was pretty tough to get a 10 on regardless, unless the rest of the card was completely on point, in my opinion. I know myself personally, if a card was that far OC, I was probably not sending it in anyway. But that's just me. And I do understand the people would casually read the website and could fall under the illusion that, oh, this card's 60-40, it still has a pretty good shot to 10, when I don't know that that was actually the case, because I think the 60-40 thing was pretty edge case. But I was curious, and the data that I'm about to show, people, and I, this is the fun with numbers, is that it should lay it out in black and white, and really it tells us nothing. And people will spin it whatever way that they want to spin it. So what I had Gemrate do, or what I asked for, and what we landed on was, can you chart me PSA's Gemrate percentage by month, by category? And when I say category, I should say by like decade. Because obviously there are going to be some variance on, what they are grading at the given time. Like right now, Prism Football grades a little rough. And if that's a bulk of their submissions, it could tank the numbers a little bit. And depending on what sets out, what releases out, etc., those things are going to kind of skew things one way or the other. So I think it's interesting to lay this out across multiple decades, because then you could kind of see, okay, well, 2000s, 80s, 90s stuff, not much of that stuff is pack fresh these days. Can you see some consistencies across the board there? So here is what we got. And once again, people are going to twist this whatever way that they want to say that they're wildly inconsistent or they're wildly consistent or whatever other narrative that they want to come up with it. I'm just throwing it out there, and then you all can do with it as you please. Over here on the right-hand side, this is 2021. This chart starts in February of 2021. That's when Gemrate has data for, and then it moves right to left. It goes more modern. So over here on the left-hand side, we have February 2025. This black dotted line is basically the total Gemrate across all the categories combined into one line. Up at the top, the dark blue line is 2020s, so ultra modern. The red line, 2010s, is essentially modern. Yellow down here is 2000s. Also, I would classify that as modern. The green down here is 90s, and then the orange below that is 80s. And really, at that point, then you're getting into vintage. You're not gemming that much stuff anyway. So generally speaking, PSA runs over the course of this data set from February 2021 until March 2025. So essentially a 2-year period. They gemmed at a 38.8% rate across the board. Now, obviously, you can see there is some time they spent above that line and some time they spent below that line. And you can also see, as of recently, it has dipped down a little bit. The most interesting thing I found in this was how everything moves together. Like, they're not consistent across the 2 years per se, if this makes sense, but they're very consistent on what they're doing on almost a month-to-month basis. It's kind of freaky, to be quite honest with you. I mean, just look at the way all these lines kind of move together. The blue, the red, the yellow, the green, and the orange all start here, and they all dip down as we move into the summer of 2021. Then they have these weird spikes up, and you see it across the board in multiple categories. Dip down, it dips in multiple categories. It goes back up, it goes up in multiple categories. When the whole thing slides down, all 4 of the categories, I guess actually 5 categories that we're looking at, the 90s or the 80s rather, here's a big dip down in the 80s, and then it kind of levels out for most of 2022 into 2023. You see that across the board in pretty much all 5 decades that we're mainly focused on here. Essentially, they were a little all over the place in 2021, which makes sense. You got to remember, too, what was going on at these various times. This was peak backlog. Stuff was crazy right now. So I get that there's probably going to be a little bit more variance there. They're probably ramping up a bunch of staff. They're probably training a bunch of new people. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes over there. We come into 2022, things settle down as we move into, let's see, about April or May, or March, April, May-ish of spring of 2022, let's call it. Things settle down, and then they run fairly consistently all the way up until early 2024. So for a good chunk of time there, this is all pretty flat. You're not seeing any crazy up downs. There's a little bit of movement here and there, but generally speaking, they are in this range. Then in 2024, early 2024, spring of 2024 into late summer 2024, it almost looks like things got a little bit easier. You could see the 2020s raise up, the 2010s raise up, the 2000s raise up, the 90s raise up, the 80s are a little all over the place, but generally speaking, they raise up. And then from like October, November of 2024, so the last 3 to 4 months, it dips back down again. Now, I want to put a big asterisk on February. That's only 1 week's worth of data. He ran these numbers on Saturday, so you're only looking at essentially 7 days worth of stuff for February. So I want to put a big asterisk on where February might end up at because it is small sample size theater. So there's definitely clearly a downward trend heading into late 2024 and into 2025. But in all honesty, it just puts them back into where they were grading for a large chunk of 2022 and 2023, which is, generally speaking, a mid 30s% Gemrate. The last couple of months, we have a 35%, just under 35%, 34%, just under 36%, 37%, 38%. Here, things got a little crazy where it jumped into the 42s, which it hadn't been until the early and mid 2021s. And then, like I said, in the middle, things basically sat in that 35% range, give or take a couple percentage points. What this means with the whole 60-40, 55-45 centering, I absolutely have no idea. I think it's an interesting data point in the discussion because remember, centering is just one factor on the card that they are looking at. So I have no idea if that's driving everything we just talked about or not. My biggest takeaway when I looked at this was, and this is not what I expected at all, was how much the lines move in sync with each other. That surprised me. Because, like I said earlier, you would expect to see some variance kind of depending on the products that are coming out. So, like I said, 2020 football, if we just looked at 2020s in modern and nothing else on here, if we just looked at the blue line, I would be like, oh, well, Prism football came out. It's gemming like crap because the QC's bad. So it's dipping these numbers down because they're grading a lot more Prism football because it's all releasing right now. But then when you see it across the board in all the decades dipping down, that to me is a little interesting. So you could and once again, people are going to paint whatever narrative that they want on this thing. You could paint the narrative that 2021 was the year of, oh my God, let's get cards out the door. Let's hire some folks. Let's get things figured out. And you kind of see these radical spikes. I'm 1000% speculating here. I have no idea. Things settled down in 2022 to throughout most of 2023 and into 2024. And they're actually fairly stable across the board. I can see how there's always going to be a little bit of jumping around in these numbers. But this chunk here in the middle seems pretty good. Then it seems like for whatever reason, across all the categories, they got slightly fast and loose and things got a little bit easier. Once again, you can see this arched up, that arched up, that arched up, these two arched up. And then it seems like they've tightened back up again to bring it back in line with where it was. That's my take on it. I am an outsider. I do not have inside information to whatever they're passing along to the grading teams, etc., whatever they're laying down. Now, took this one step further, and said, well, how does this compare to another grading company? And we did the same thing with SGC. So here's SGC's graph. Now, their overall trend line is much lower, which is not surprising. Because they grade a lot more vintage. That's what they're known for. So the fact that this dotted line, that their overall gem rate percentage skews lower, is not surprising to me. The interesting thing here is it follows a fairly similar, it doesn't exactly overlay, but once again, you see the same movements across all the decades. And once again, I want to focus on the 2020s, the 2010s, the 2000s, the 90s, and the 80s. Because when you get into the older stuff, it just doesn't happen that often. But, all these lines, the red, blue, yellow, and green is the primary focuses with a little bit on orange, all move relatively in the same flow together. You get a little spike up here, Look, like they all start up here, dips down, dips down, dips down, dips down. That one stays about flat. Dips or comes up, comes up, comes up, comes up, flattens out a little bit in this section here. Dips down, dips down, dips down. That one stayed flat. Okay, that went on for a few months, and then in early 2023, this shot way up, this shot way up, leading into all the way into early 2024. So for most of 2023, they essentially started grading at a higher Gemrate percentage. That one climb, that one climb, that one climb, that one climb. It's just very interesting to me that it is across the board, that it is not just one particular decade that you see the big spike or decrease in. So clearly company-wide at SGC, at least in my mind, something changed at the beginning of 2023, and they're like, hey, maybe they slightly shifted their standards around a little bit behind the scenes. Who knows? Things creep up, 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 up. They peaked in early 2024, and then it looks like they tighten back up again. Goes down, goes down, goes down, goes down, and goes down. And once again, since we're looking at multiple decades, it's not like you could say, oh, well, card quality got worse for ultra modern releases. Sure, okay, maybe, but then explain why the 2010s moved the same way as the 2020s and why the 2000s and 90s and the 80s also followed suit. So while drastically different, like these two things look very different to one another, their flow pattern is the same. Like they all flow together. Both of them, all the decades move in sync with all the other decades. I found that fascinating. So they're actually, to me, this shows that they're, in the way that they're grading at the individual time, they actually seem very consistent. The fact that across multiple decades, they would sync up and move loosely together is very interesting to me. And once again, I don't know what this has to do with the current centering nonsense that's going on with the 55, 45, 60, 40, because that's only a small factor in how a card grades. But once again, people are going to take this and run with it and do whatever they want with it, which is a little bit a part of the fun. Do with it as you please. Curious for your interpretations in the comment section down below, as I am sure this will be a spicy one. But those are the numbers. Like I said, this does not tell the whole story. Centering is but a small fraction of how a card grades, but I thought this was interesting nonetheless. Even if it doesn't directly tie into what we're talking about, I think this was a very intriguing way to look at these numbers and kind of see how these all sync up across the various different decades for multiple grading companies, PSA and SGC. So that's all I got. I am sure this is not the last that this topic will be discussed, as it is the topic du jour this week in the hobby sport, last week into this week, and I have a feeling this will not be the end of it. We will catch you boys and girls on the next one. Peace.